When trying to understand political science, a good place to start would be to figure out what we mean when we say politics. According to the textbook, politics is activity related to influencing, making, or implementing collective decisions for a political community. This is a somewhat good start, but we have to wonder, what do we mean when we say influencing? What do we mean when we say collective decisions? What is a political community? Each of these are concepts, big ideas in and of themselves. They are really important in political science, but we'll get to them later. So we need to take a step back. For the purpose of the very beginning of studying politics, politics can be defined as the following: power relations between people. This is a basic definition that comes with two underlying assumptions. The first is that power relations happen between people everywhere, all the time, not just in government. Therefore, it can be concluded that political science isn't just the study of government, it's the study of power just about everywhere. The idea that political science is only all about government is a common misconception. The second assumption is one that actually might be false. If we are really studying about power, are there things in the world that exert power over people, aside from other people? If so, how would you revise this first definition? Now that we've come to a basic understanding about politics, the next step is to think about power. What do we mean when we say power? According to the textbook, power is the ability to achieve an objective by influencing the behavior of others, particularly to get them to do what they would not have otherwise done. When you think of it, this is a really profound idea. Power is all around us. Power is exerted over us, and we exert power over others everywhere, all the time. We're constantly changing the way we do things from how we would have done them initially in so many different ways for so many different reasons. So coming back to our first discussion, again, we see more clearly that politics isn't just about government. It's about pretty much everything. Most people assume that politics is the study of government, and many times it is. But political science can be much broader than that. Generally speaking, it seeks to understand how people exert power over others in all circumstances. Now we need to figure out the ways in which people exert power over each other. One way to think of it would be to divide the types of power into four main categories: coercion, inducement, persuasion, and leadership. What is coercion? Is it the use of rewards or bribes, or the use of truthful or misleading information? Is it the threat of reprisal if someone doesn't do something? Or is it setting an example, as in soft leadership? If you guessed that it is using the threat of reprisal if someone doesn't do something, then you guessed right. What is inducement? If you guessed rewards or bribes, that would be correct. What is persuasion? It's the use of truthful or misleading information. What is leadership? You guessed it. It's setting an example, something referred to in the literature as soft leadership. So we've looked at different ways that people exert power over others. Another really relevant question for understanding power is the following. Who has more power? Who has the most power? How do we begin to think about this? A good place to start would be to understand the political agenda. According to the textbook, the political agenda is the issues that are considered important and given priority in political deliberation. The question becomes, how does the political agenda fit into our estimation of how powerful someone can be? Stephen Luce is a political scientist who came up with some pretty interesting ideas on how to evaluate how powerful that people can be. The first level of power in what he calls the three faces of power is the ability to affect decisions. Basically, this is the idea that if you are given a problem, you have the power to decide how to solve the problem and get people to do as you say. For many of us who have never experienced much power, this seems pretty powerful. However, Stephen Luce sees this as the very beginning of power for powerful people. I like to use the analogy of the corporate board of directors. Every company has a board of directors, and this board of directors is responsible for establishing accountability for company management and assuring reasonable third-party controls through independent reviews of the company. Basically, the board of directors makes sure that company management is being responsible and it steers the company in a profitable direction. So basically, if you were a board member of, say, a t-shirt company, and the t-shirt company is losing profits because it's not able to sell orange t-shirts, as a board member, you can decide that you can switch to blue t-shirts. You can tell everybody that next season, blue is going to be in style. If everybody agrees, basically your plan is put into action as you delegate the tasks. This gives you a certain amount of power in the company. But this is the very first step of power. Power for beginners, or as I like to say, Bobo power. So what's more powerful than that? The next step in power is the ability to determine what's on the board's agenda, and in this way ensure that issues are not raised. Say this t-shirt company decides that they are losing profits because they are selling wrong colored t-shirts. Who is to say that this is the company's biggest problem? Someone decided that this was the problem and put it on the agenda for Bobo Power Player to solve. Maybe this company is losing profit, but perhaps as well, this company uses child labor. Somehow, this issue didn't make the agenda. What then? Being the person who makes the agenda is really important. In government, it might surprise you to know that in Canada, very few people get to make the agenda for the House of Commons. Barring some important examples, virtually all topics deemed worthy of legislation is determined by the Prime Minister, his office known as the PMO's office, and to greater or lesser extent, depending, the 35 people who are in Cabinet at the moment. We'll learn more about that later. In this way, Canada is one of the least democratic democracies in the democratic world. So making the agenda for a corporate meeting is pretty powerful, but they're still more powerful than that. The ultimate power, the ability to affect the dominant ideas of society. Culture isn't democratically determined. There are powerful people who determine what our values are. So the very fact that child labor is considered a problem is only so because some very powerful people decided that it's wrong to make children work. This value was a choice for us, encouraged by some very powerful people. Stephen Lukes puts it this way. To put the matter sharply, A may exercise power over B by getting him to do what he does not want to do, but he also exerts power over him by influencing, shaping, or determining his overall wants. If you are the person who can do this, this makes you exceedingly powerful. According to Forbes, in 2018, these were the most powerful people. Some people may seem familiar to you and unsurprising, and others you might not recognize. It's interesting to try to understand what it is that makes them powerful, and using Stephen Lukes' framework of analysis helps us do just that. The next concepts that the first chapter of the textbook explores are state and government. The textbook defines the state as an independent, self-governing political community whose governing institutions are able to make and enforce rules that are binding on the people living within a particular territory. This includes national and provincial governments, as well as institutions and agencies that act on behalf of the state, so police and military, and state-owned corporations. For example, Canadian Pacific Railways is one of our state-owned corporations. The state's legal name is the Crown. This is a tidbit of information that can find itself as a wildcard question on a quiz. In order to understand this further, it's helpful to look at other surface definitions offered by Wikipedia, for example. Wikipedia reflects the idea that states inevitably have a government, but it also goes a bit further in defining what it means when we say the state is independent. According to Wikipedia, independence and self-governance is sovereignty, and sovereignty is the monopoly of the use of force of people on people in the territory. This is a pretty profound idea. This is the idea that nobody has the power to use coercive force over anybody unless that person is acting as an agent of the state. When you think about it, there are very few people in your life authorized to hit you, unless, of course, they're your parents, and that only sometimes and increasingly less. Government is the set of institutions that has the authority to make executive decisions. Governments propose laws, taxes, and expenditures to appropriate legislative bodies, and they oversee the implementation of laws and policies. Again, this concept is defined with a whole bunch of concepts that we will look into further. So if the idea of government remains a little hazy to you, don't worry. We're going to take more time to look at what authority means, what executive decisions are, what laws are as opposed to policies, and so on. In order to better understand what a state and government is from the beginning, I like to compare it with what we had before we had states and governments. A long time ago, what we had were empires. So here you see the Egyptian Empire, which stretched from 3000 BC to 500 AD. Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Babylonia. Indus Valley. The Chinese dynasties are really fascinating because they only ended at the turn of the last century. And if you go to China, many get a sense of how the empire still plays a huge role in the consciousness of its citizens. There's the Mayans, the Greco-Romans, The sovereign state system comes out of the Renaissance and was further developed thanks to the Industrial Revolution. One of the first observations that we can make is that compared to the empire, the sovereign state system is actually really young. Another observation we can make is that it's fundamentally very different for many reasons. The one that I want to talk about now is the fact that in the past, you had your emperor who lived in the middle of the city, and the emperor made decisions, and the people most affected by his decisions were the people that inevitably lived closest to him in the emperor's court. And then beyond that, the people most affected by the emperor's decisions were the ones who lived just beyond the court, but within the castle gates, or just outside. They would often be artisans and merchants, people who supplied goods and services to the emperor and his entourage. Beyond that, there were agricultural lands. So you have agriculturalists that supplied to each other, the emperor, the emperor's entourage, and artisans, tradespeople, and others. They were a little less subject to the decisions of the emperor. Why? Because enforcement of policy wasn't necessary as much as in the city, and also sometimes it depended on capacity. For example, if you lived far enough away from the emperor's castle, you might not be taxed as often. Beyond that, there's what used to be called beyond the pale. Beyond the pale was people who lived outside the border of the empire, and they didn't have a sense of belonging with an empire, and they're not affected by the rules of any emperor. In contrast, by now the planet has been carved up into different states. In the sovereign state system, there isn't 1 inch of the planet that doesn't belong to one state or another. Another thing about the state is that it can be argued that the industrial era makes people living within their state borders much more subject to the decisions handed down by state governments for many reasons. One important one being that the government has much more capacity than before to enforce their decisions on people that live within their border. So the sovereign state system is very different than the empires that have characterized most of human history. Next up, authority and legitimacy. People with political authority say that they are authorized to govern. There are many sources of authority: God, tradition, legal rules, legal procedures, such as elections. There are lots of sources, and there are lots of combinations of sources. If the source of the authority is accepted by the community, then the person not only has authority, they also have legitimacy. Legitimacy, accordingly, is acceptance by the political community that those in positions of authority have the right to govern. Here, to symbolize authority, I've used the sheriff. The person who applied for the job with credentials and passed the process was chosen by other authorities, and that person is now the sheriff. The star badge specifically symbolizes the sheriff's right to use coercive force on a population. I've used the image of Nelson Mandela to represent legitimacy. He was perhaps the most legitimate leader in human history. People point to the worthiness of his cause, achieving rights for Blacks in South Africa, especially the right to vote. They can also point to his single-mindedness, his effective pursuit of the cause, and overall, the sacrifices that he made to achieve his cause. By the time he acceded to the presidency of South Africa, he had much of the country and the whole world behind him. When government is deemed illegitimate, what happens? If you thought revolution, uprising, civil disobedience, strikes, you're on the right track. What are the threats to government legitimacy in Canada? During times of colonization, given that treaties were signed, and some treaties were not signed, some Indigenous First Nations never gave up their claim to sovereignty. Therefore, they don't accept government sovereignty on themselves and the lands on which they live. In 1995, nearly half of Quebec voted to separate in a referendum. In order to garner legitimacy, the Canadian government sometimes tries to employ the power of persuasion by controlling information, gaining media exposure for their views, and carrying their messages to the public through advertising. A clip from Canada's National Economic Plan of 2011 is included below. In addition to this, the Canadian government tries to maintain legitimacy by cooperating with other levels of government, provincial, territorial, and municipal, and they seek input from other organizations, groups, and individuals when writing legislation and policy. Now let's look at democracy. In the context of Canada's democracy, we'll look at two main topics: how Canada's democracy works and how we can make it better. In this first part, we'll look at Canada's democratic roots, direct democracy, and then we'll learn about its current features as a representative and also a liberal democracy. A good beginning definition of democracy is rule by the people, either directly or through the election of representatives. Direct democracy is a form of democracy in which citizens are directly involved in making the governing decisions. It's often assumed that in ancient Greece, this was an experiment that took place over a relatively short period of time and that it was restricted. Power was in the hands of relatively few people. Women and slaves and the foreign-born were excluded. I like to think of Athenian direct democracy a bit differently, though. Going back to our empire's timeline, we see that ancient Greek democracy developed around the 6th century BC until it was suppressed in 322 BC. So it lasted over 300 years, similar to the length of time that our own sovereign state system has been in place. Therefore, 1. The ancient Athenians practiced democracy for longer than we have thus far. And 2. Once we understand how Canadian democracy functions, it might be reasonable to conclude that power is concentrated in Canada as well, although the mechanisms that make this so are a bit different than the basic limited suffrage in ancient Athens. This is a depiction of what ancient Athenian direct democracy could have looked like. Representative democracy is defined in the book as a form of democracy in which citizens elect representatives to make governing decisions on their behalf. This is a floor plan of MP seats in the House of Commons. There are 338 seats, representing federal ridings of, on average, 75,000 people each. Guess what party has the dark blue seats? If you guessed Conservatives, you guessed right. Can you guess the light blue seats? If you guessed the Bloc Québécois, again, you guessed right. The orange seats? NDP. The red seats? Liberals, the Green seats, the Green Party. And for bonus points, do you know who are seated in the 2 gray seats? Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, both independent MPs in the wake of the Bombardier scandal from Parliament's last session. When it comes to democratic ideals, the book points out that representative democracy doesn't work so well if the values and interests of our political parties don't align well with the values and interests of the general population. And if our political parties aren't transparent enough with voters to give voters a clear understanding of how the party will act once in power. Worse, parties sometimes ignore their election promises altogether. Other ways that representative democracy betrays democratic ideals in Canada include how Canada's unelected Senate can reject legislation passed by Canada's elected House of Commons, and how sometimes the party who wins the most seats doesn't represent the majority of Canadian voters. We'll explain this in more detail later on. As well, we'll look at how power concentrates in the hands of the Prime Minister, his advisors and his ministers, and the role of large corporations, other elite groups, and lobbyists in shaping Canada's legislation. This brings us to liberal democracy. In addition to being a representative democracy, Canada's democracy has a number of features to help keep it straight. Together, these features fall under the concept of liberal democracy. According to the textbook, liberal democracy can be understood as a political system in which powers of government are limited by law, the rights of the people to engage in political activity freely are well established, and fair elections are held to choose those who make governing decisions. This means that in our liberal democracy, all persons have the freedom to express their views, including the freedom to criticize government and the freedom to organize themselves for political action. All persons are free to compete for political office in free and fair elections. The communications media should be free of government control so that diverse sources of information and ideas are easily available to the public. And finally, an important part of our liberal democracy is its constitutional government. According to the text, a constitutional government is one that consistently acts in keeping established fundamental rules and principles. These fundamental rules are laid down by our Constitution and upheld by our independent judiciary system. Taken together, this is rule of law. We've looked at how Canada's democracy functions very roughly. Now we'll talk about how we can make it better. We've seen that Canada's democracy comes out of the practice of direct democracy in ancient Athens, and what we have now is a representative liberal democracy. The question becomes, what's next? How do we move forward if we want to build more meaningful democracy? Plebiscitary democracy is viewed by many as a way forward. According to the textbook, it involves the use of referendums, initiatives, and recall procedures as an alternative to what some view as the elite-oriented nature of representative democracy. The referendum is a vote by the people on a particular question asked by a government or a legislative body. Canada has used it 3 times: to prohibit alcohol, to impose conscription, and to change the Constitution under the Charlottetown Accord. Provincial and local governments use referendums as well. Quebec famously used two to ask if the population wanted to separate from the rest of Canada. A common critique of the referendum is that organizers can manipulate voters by the way they choose how to word their questions. In the case of the Quebec referendum, unsurprisingly, there were accusations that the questions were made deliberately confusing so as to encourage more positive votes. Initiatives give citizens the right to have a proposition that they would have drafted put to a vote by the electorate. This is done through circulating a petition. The mechanism is used in British Columbia, the EU, and France, Germany, and Ireland, the Philippines, Switzerland, and most of the US, half of the states, and commonly at the local level. A common criticism is that some wedge issues can get lots of signatures, despite not representing the overall values of the political community. A wedge issue is one that can either attract or alienate political supporters based on controversial topics. Common wedge issues include abortion and gun control. In Canada, at the federal level, the initiative that has garnered the most votes in recent history is one that seeks to abolish gun control legislation. Despite attracting over 250,000 signatures, this demand went nowhere since the federal government doesn't use the initiative mechanism. In the US, a spoof initiative to get government to build a replica of Star Wars Death Star in space got enough signatures to force an official response from the government. The text of the reply is featured on this site after the clip. Recall is a procedure that allows citizens to recall their representative and require that a new election be held, provided that sufficient names are obtained on a petition. BC is the only province in Canada that has this mechanism. In contrast, despite 250,000 votes, a petition to force Quebec Premier Jean Charest to resign in the wake of the 2015 student strikes went nowhere, since we don't have the recall mechanism. Closely related to plebiscitary democratic mechanisms, deliberative democracy is a form of democracy in which governing decisions are made based on discussion by citizens. In BC and Ontario, a random selection of citizens were used to deliberate and make recommendations about changes to the province's electoral systems. In Montreal, given the COVID situation, Projet Montréal is holding consultations online on a great number of issues. The textbook mentions that the big problem with consultative democracy is that interest for it isn't very high. Many people are just not willing to devote the time and energy needed to discuss and deliberate on complex issues. Where active participation has changed, however, is that people are increasingly taking an interest on political issues or concerns that affect them. Participation in groups seeking to influence public policy is rising thanks to communications technologies and education, like this class. The major flaw is that those most likely to participate are the best educated with higher social and economic status. The textbook concludes that unless major efforts are made to involve a wide diversity of people, deliberative democracy may result in recommendations that do not adequately consider the views and interests of many elements of society. Social democracy is the perspective that great social and economic equality is needed for a country to be fully democratic. In this perspective, without universal healthcare, education, and childcare, less advantaged members would have very little chance of resisting the messaging of large corporations and members of elite groups promoting the values and interests of the corporate world and their influence on government decisions.